It's come up in exams before. 2019 exam choice, they asked this in your HSC Biology NESA released questions. So the 80-page document I told you what to start doing, that includes questions about this graph. So let's start going through it now. You see day 1 and you see day 28. What marks those days, right? How does this body have an internal clock where there is a day 21 and day 28? This is what we call your ovarian cycle. So your title should be now Ovarian Cycle. Okay? Also known as a menstrual cycle. So those of you who put your hands up for wanting to do medicine, you actually have to know the cycle very well, because a very common presenting complaint is a female presenting with vaginal bleeding. And there are so many causes for it. There are structural causes like polyps, tumors. There's, things like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or endometriosis, which can cause abnormalities here. So you need to understand this normal to understand all of that abnormal stuff we're talking about. So day 1 to day 28. What marks day 1? Who can tell me? Day 1 is the first day of menstruation, right? And you might know menstruation as bleeding, but to be very specific, let's have a look at what's happening at the uterus. Menstruation is when these surface cells, everyone, they start to shed. And with those surface cells shedding, you also shed some of the blood vessel and the blood inside those blood vessels. Okay, so what happens now is you start the shedding of cells and blood. That's what happens in menstruation. Now, why does that happen? Why are we getting the shedding of the lining of the endometrium? I want you to utilize first principles here. What did we say estrogen and progesterone did? Go back to that. Ethan, what did estrogen do? All right, we'll move on to Alyssa. What did estrogen do?
It stimulates the growth of the endometrium.
Very good. And what does progesterone do?
It maintains the endometrium.
Very good, right? I'm going to add one more thing for progesterone, and this is very important to understand everything, is progesterone is going to increase blood supply. Both of them will do this, but specifically progesterone. So going back up here, we're also going to write progesterone is going to increase the blood supply to the endometrium. More blood is good. And the way it does that, everyone, is the blood vessels going to that endometrium, they get bigger in size. It's what we call vaso meaning vessel, and dilate meaning get bigger. So progesterone is also going to cause vasodilation. Can anyone tell me then, what would the opposite of progesterone do to those lining endometrial cells? We'll use this diagram to understand this. So don't worry about times for now. But what would this drop in progesterone do? So we said progesterone, it increases blood supply to the endometrial lining by vasodilating blood vessels. If you suddenly dropped progesterone, what is going to happen to that blood vessel? So all these spiral vessels you're seeing going to the endometrium. Are they going to stay dilated or are they going to constrict, Varun?
They're going to constrict, so.
Exactly, right? So when they constrict, think about this. Constriction of blood vessels stops oxygen, it stops glucose getting to the tissue. Can it make any more ATP? Can it do any of its cellular processes? No. Waste start to build up, toxins start to build up, and the cells start to die. And that is the basis for menstruation. We'll talk about why the progesterone drops, but I want you to remember this. It's a drop in progesterone that results in, coming back, where was our little diagram with our graph? Yeah, so it's the drop in progesterone that results in shedding of the uterine lining, okay? And this day we get bleeding, even spot bleeding, we'd call that the first day of menses or day 1 of the ovarian cycle. Okay, so this is day 1. Good. We'll explain why the progesterone drops later. Okay. Now, what's going to happen is, I want you to look at this. How many days do we have in this graph, in this ovarian cycle? Georgina, how many days are present?
28.
Good. We're going to break it down into 2 sections, right? The first 14 days and the second 14 days. And the reason is, at day 14, something very important happens. And you can see it written right here. At day 14, we will get the process, we'll get ovulation occurring. And we'll explain what happens there. So break it down. There's a 28-day ovarian cycle. Day 14, right at the center, is ovulation. Okay? Now, between day 1 to day 14, we are going to have everything you learned happening. The hypothalamus releases GnRH. Jessica, what gets released at the pituitary?
FHS and LH.
Good. FSH or LH. So FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone and LH for luteinizing hormone, right? Jessica, I want you to imagine you did no biology. If someone asked you what follicle stimulating hormone does, and you had to give me a 2-word answer, what would you say? Tough one. Give it a go.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So you know no biology. I want you to imagine, wipe out all the biology you know. What would follicle stimulating hormone do?
It stimulates follicles.
There you go, right? So see, this is where you have to just use your brains. A lot of students get all of this basic stuff. What is the word? What do the words mean? FSH is going to travel to the ovary. And remember I showed you the follicle, which contained that central ova and the outer cells that are, hormonally active. It's going to start growing the follicle. Does everyone see that? Right, so that's a function of FSH, right? It's going to travel to the ovary. We're going to draw ovary like this. It's going to cause the follicles to go from tiny little follicles to start growing in size. Okay? And those follicles are going to start releasing estrogen. That's what's going to happen first. Okay? LH, very similarly, is also going to prepare the follicles for ovulation. In fact, LH, there's only one thing you need to know. Ovulation. It is going to trigger ovulation. It's a spike in LH that is going to trigger the ovulatory process. Good. Now, what did we say estrogen is going to do? Estrogen is going to travel back to the pituitary, back to the hypothalamus, and decrease synthesis of those hormones. Okay? But the net effect, everyone, is during the first 14 days, estrogen slightly continues to increase. And have a look at what's happening here. So from day 1 to day 14, have a look at estrogen. What is it doing? It's slowly but steadily increasing to a set point. Does everyone see that? And that's because GnRH is being released from the hypothalamus. It's causing gonadotropin release at the pituitaries. And that's slowly causing an increase in estrogen. Very good. Why is LH and FSH low though? Why are they, fluctuating but relatively low? Who can tell me? It's a very valid exam question. Identify why LH and FSH are low during the follicular phase, which is the first 14 days. Any ideas? Pranav?
Is it because the estrogen is required at a steady rate, so the FSH and LH are only
Pranav,
constant?
you learned there is only one thing that lowers FSH, LH, and GnRH. What is that one thing? You see arrows pointing towards them. You see a negative sign. What is the one thing that can lower LH and FSH?
To the increase of estrogen.
Yes. Still wouldn't get you the mark yet. I'm looking for those 2 words I asked all of you at the beginning of today's lesson.
Negative feedback.
Good. That is the answer, right? Since estrogen is quite high, it's going to exert more negative feedback and keep LH and FSH very low. Does that make sense to everyone? right? So the key thing you need to know here in this follicular phase is there's going to be an increase in estrogen. And number two, so from 0 to 14 days, is an increase in estrogen. And that makes sense because GnRH is causing FSH-LH release. FSH-LH will cause more and more estrogen release. But there's also going to be negative feedback, and that's going to result in quite low levels of LH and FSH. What changes though? What do you all notice? Something magical happens at this point here. Yep. Who wants
Is
to?
it the spike in luteinizing hormone?
Yeah, it's quite weird. Estrogen is still high, but suddenly both FSH and LH suddenly spike very significantly. Does everyone see that? Right? So far you understand everything up until you understand this section, negative feedback. That's why FSH, LH are low. You understand why estrogen is high. How did it suddenly change? Lookman, what did you learn at school regarding the change in these hormones? Any ideas?
I'm not sure.
It's all right. See, this is a thing. School, they notoriously find it hard. I've never seen a single student come to class already knowing this because they don't teach this at school. I'm not sure why.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, question is why is there a sudden surge in LH and FSH? My red arrows that I've drawn right here on this page, why are they suddenly increased? Jerry?
Because of ovulation. Oh no, that causes.
Ovulation has not happened yet. So you see the dotted vertical line? That's your
Yeah.
ovulation. So these hormones are increasing to cause ovulation, but why are they increasing? Pranav?
Is it
Yeah.
is it because there's a positive feedback now?
Very good. Very good. See, some of you might have remembered last lesson. Some of you are very curious, and it's the curious students that do very well in biology. You asked me, so why is there a positive sign? You explain the negative that estrogen does, which makes sense. But why does these nodes, why do they have a positive sign as well, going from estrogen back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus? And now I will answer that for you. Okay. And it's that when estrogen gets to very, very high levels, such as you see in this graph here, right? So let me write out all of this vertical lines. So that circle, that red circle, where I've circled estrogen at its very highest point, what that does is when estrogen is at that high of a concentration, it starts acting on slightly different parts of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and it causes sudden positive feedback, a very powerful surge of positive feedback. Now, think about this. Negative feedback went back and it inhibited GnRH, FSH, and LH. If we suddenly switch to positive feedback, what is that going to do to FSH and LH, everyone?
Increase.
Suddenly increase them. Very good, right? So I want you to remember about day 13, one day before, right? So about day 13, estrogen reaches high enough levels, and it switches from negative to positive feedback.
Can I ask quickly?
Yep.
Why does it switch? Is it like getting ready for like a sperm to come in or something?
So that's how you can understand it. That's the purpose of why it's switched. And we'll talk about that very soon. But remember, these hormones are not sentient in any way. They're just doing their job. So what technically happens is that estrogen, when it reaches high enough levels, it can penetrate the brain to different parts of the hypothalamus and pituitary. And so it can switch its action from negative to positive feedback. But you're right. The end result of all of that is, well, Jessica, we caused a surge in LH and FSH. What is the one word I put next to LH?
Ovulation.
Good. So Jessica, if you don't have ovulation, you don't have any ova being released. Will you ever have a zygote and will you ever have a pregnancy?
No.
No. So you need this to happen. You need estrogen to switch to positive feedback So it can cause a surge in LH and release the ova. So then we can start to get fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy. Okay, so the end result is, why is estrogen doing all of this? It's to force ovulation at day 14. Okay, very good. Good question. So yes, which is sudden increase in LH and FSH. And it's the surge in LH. This is the highest yield part of this graph. If you forget everything about this graph, the one thing you cannot forget is that a drop in estrogen causes menstruation, a drop in progesterone and estrogen, and a surge in LH causes ovulation. This is what they love to ask, if anything. Very high yield from an exam point of view. Okay? Good. So what we see is a surge in LH at day 14, and look what happens at the ovary. Right at day 14, when we get that surge, we get the release of the ova. Very good. Now, I want to see who paid attention. What did I say about the cells on the outside of this follicle? What are they doing? So right here is your ova. But what about all the other cells? What is that doing?
It's the hormones.
Very good. Those are the cells, right? Imagine little factory workers and those edges that are pumping out your estrogen and progesterone. So even after the ova comes out, you will still get estrogen and progesterone release from these outer lining cells of the follicle, right? So have a look at what's happening to estrogen and progesterone, right? As soon as we had ovulation, look at what's happening to estrogen and progesterone. The progesterone is the purple, estrogen is the yellow. What do you see happening to them? They still keep on being released and they still keep on increasing. Very good. Good. Now let's go back to our slightly earlier diagram. Go back to this one. This one. Okay, I'm going to rub all of this out and we're going to talk about what's happened after day 14. So Pranav, day 14, what's the one thing you need to remember? What happens at day 14?
There's a surge in luteinizing hormone and there's ovulation.
Very good, right? So what happens is we release the ova into the fallopian tube, and the ova will go and sit in the outer 1/3 of the fallopian tube, right here. What is it waiting for? It's only going to wait 48 hours for this, right? What is this ova waiting for?
The sperm.
Yeah, it's waiting for a spermatozoa. So do you all agree? Right now, there are two things that can occur. We can get fertilization, or we can get no fertilization, right? We're pretty much playing a game here. Kirthana, I want you to pick a pathway that we're going to go down. For a female, Kirthana, what's the most likely outcome for an ovulatory cycle? Is every ovulatory cycle going to result in fertilization, pregnancy, or more than not, do we get no fertilization? Can anyone answer that very quickly?
No fertilization.
Very good. Okay, so more than likely, we're going to get no fertilization. I just want to preface everyone. We're going to go back to in-person soon. And so those of you who haven't answered my questions, I will ask you a bit more when we go back to in-center, okay? Good. So do try to answer as many questions as you'd like here. Good. So we're not going to have fertilization, no fertilization occurring. What happens after fertilization? There's a little flowchart you should have in your head. We get ovulation. You should have fertilization. And what happens after fertilization? Who can tell me? Think about what estrogen is doing. Where is the estrogen acting? It's acting on the lining of the uterus. Why?
To implant the
Yes,
thing.
implantation and pregnancy. This is what your head should be thinking. Ovulation, fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy. Okay? So right now we've said that we have ovulation, right? Ovulation always happens, but we have no fertilization. That's the path that we're going down. Are we going to have implantation, everyone?
No, sir.
So would we need estrogen to keep on thickening the endometrial lining and preparing for pregnancy and progesterone preventing any contractions at all? Is the uterus going to wait and stay in that phase where it's very rich in glucose and cells? It's a very energy intensive process.
No, it's not.
Oh, right. The body needs a way to tell the ovaries to stop making estrogen, right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you know how some women get like cramps and stuff? Is it because of the contractions happening in the uterus from the P hormone thing?
Yeah, that's right. So the reason that you do get a cramping pain is because you start to get uterine contractions due to the drop in progesterone that's about to happen. Okay, so I'm going to explain that now. So we don't have implantation. Now, someone asked me last lesson a very good question. He said, what is causing or what is being detected in a pregnancy test? Does anyone know the answer before I tell you the answer? This is a test that like I'm telling you, I have my exams in, I think, the 9th of November, and they can ask you anything. And whenever it's a female of reproductive age, if I forget to add on this test, I can fail my exam because it's a very important test to identify pregnancy. What is the test?
Beta HCG.
Very good, right? Lukman's already on his way to becoming a doctor. Very good. So the test you need to order in any woman of reproductive age is a beta HCG test. And I guess the importance here is if we did have fertilization happening, right? We did have fertilization, we would have had implantation. And what would happen is that embryo, it contains two cells, right? It contains these inner cells that is going to become the actual embryo. And it consists of outer cells, which will eventually become the placenta. And the placenta is hormonally active. So from these outer cells of that embryo, we're going to start releasing beta HCG. So the process of implantation results in those outer cells releasing beta HCG. Let's think about what HCG means. And you're going to tell me where this hormone is going to go and act. HCG stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. It's telling you something. It's trying to tell you what this hormone is doing. It's a human hormone. Chorion means placenta. So what did I tell you? It comes from those cells that are going to become the placenta. And it's a gonadotropin. What does that mean to all of you?
Acts on the gonads.
There you go. So this hormone is going to go back and act on the ovary and say, mission successful. We have landed on the moon. We've landed on the endometrium. Continue to release your life support, your estrogen and progesterone. And so the ovaries will keep on making estrogen and progesterone. And it's going to keep on thickening the lining and protecting that pregnancy. Do you all see that little closed loop happening right there? Right? Mission is a success. You radio back to, home tower on Earth, and you tell them that you still need resources, and they keep releasing those resources. That's what's happening here, right? Implanted embryo releases hormones to tell the ovary to keep on making estrogen and progesterone. But we've all mentioned that fertilization more than likely does not happen every ovulatory cycle. And so that means implantation is not going to happen. If there's no implantation, everyone, will there be any beta HCG release? Very good. So the thing you need to identify is if there is no implantation, there will be no beta HCG release. So is this chorionic gonadotropin going to go back to the ovary and tell it to keep on making estrogen and progesterone? No. So what's going to happen to estrogen and progesterone levels? There you go. Drop in estrogen and progesterone. And this takes us back to a little deja vu. What was the first thing I explained to all of you? It is the drop in estrogen and progesterone that causes shedding of the endometrium in day 1 of the next menstrual cycle. And now we go back to day 1. And this process will repeat every 28 days from menarche, which is the onset of ovulation in a female, to menopause, which is when the ovaries fail.